Well, from the grasslands, we are going to head back to the ocean. So, a conservation biologist and National Geographic Explorer, Dr. Andrea Marshall leads groundbreaking research and conservation programs globally to save endangered sharks, rays, and other threatened marine megafauna in some of their most critical habitats. So, she was the first person to complete a doctoral dissertation on manta rays. She developed the first online database for them as well, and in her career has discovered 2 new species of these giant rays. She's the co-founder of the Marine Megafauna Foundation, an NGO dedicated to saving our ocean giants from extinction. So let's bring her in live with us right now. Hi, Andre. How are we doing?
Hi, Joe. It's always so nice to see you.
It's always great to see you, and more clear than usual. Usually our connections are in Mozambique or in the field. But today we're going to have a nice, I probably shouldn't say this because it's going to jinx us. We're going to have a nice clean connection today.
Yeah, you caught me in Florida. I'm actually on my way back to Africa tomorrow, but I'm happy to be able to hopefully have a stable connection with you today.
All right, awesome. Well, I love every single part of the work you do. I can't wait for you to share it today. I'm going to disappear backstage and let you take over for a bit.
All right, great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be able to be participating in an event like this, which is really kind of focusing on women trailblazers. That's something that's particularly close to my heart. And I kind of created a little bit of a different show today because I was really inspired by a lot of the other talks that we've been hearing this weekend. So I'm just going to share my screen really quick. And give that presentation to you. You seeing that okay, Joe?
There we go. Yeah, it looks good. Do you want to try and hit play, see if it'll go nice and full screen for us?
I'm going to do that.
Perfect.
There we go. All right. So as Joe mentioned, I do help run an organization called the Marine Megafauna Foundation, which is an organization that I co-founded many years ago now. Sometimes the name can be a bit of a mouthful for people, but basically we focus on endangered, usually quite endangered or at least threatened marine megafauna species. So large animals, usually very iconic or charismatic, but mostly we focus on them because they're oftentimes the first animals to be removed from ecosystems, and they're very, very difficult to bring back. So those are kind of the flagship species that we work on, in order to try and get the primary research done that is going to inform on the management of remaining populations around the globe. We've been going for quite a while, about 20 years now, with that mission of saving our ocean giants from extinction. And we do work all over the world. So this organization has projects all over the world on many different species, but we do focus in some very specific core areas and have really long-running programs in some of those areas. We started as primarily researchers, and I'm so privileged to be able to lead research teams all over the world that do work on different types of threatened species. I'm very proud of the science that the organization puts out. And as one of the principal scientists, it's, like I said, a real honor for me to lead a lot of these teams in the development of ideas and try and figure out what our objectives are and how to protect some of these animals in their most critical habitats. But over the years, we've grown from just doing primary research to really trying to get more actively involved in conservation and trying to get that data being used to underpin local management, but also international conservation. And I'll talk a little bit later about the work that we're doing now to protect actual ecosystems, which I'm really excited about. But one of the things that was really exciting for me about this weekend was, this is, I think the reason that Joe put this this weekend together was to really highlight some of the women who are blazing trails. But I found it really, really interesting that a lot of the women are sharing how we got to where we are, because I think that can be incredibly helpful as people watch on and think about, a lot of the questions coming in are, how do I start, or how do I navigate to get to where you guys are now? And sometimes, people in my position and a lot of these other really, really incredible women, we focus on the achievements and rather than kind of how we got to where we are. So I kind of just wanted to take the time to talk about my story because I think it's relevant. And, you know, a lot of the women this weekend, we share a similar story. I mean, I was a tree hugger literally from the beginning. And I was always just enchanted with the marine environment. I was always obsessed with marine life, particularly sharks. So, and this didn't really come from my parents. You know, my mom can barely swim. You know, it wasn't that my parents were actively involved in conservation or were, you know, divers or anything like that. It's just something that I connected with from a really, really young age. I loved Tanya's story earlier this weekend that she fell in love with the ocean, even living in a landlocked environment in Europe. Sometimes something just sparks you, sets you off, and you kind of find your passion. I have a young daughter myself. She's just turned 6. And my mom used to tell me at age 5, I used to tell people when they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would tell them I wanted to be a shark biologist. And she would shake her head because she had no idea where that came from. But it's something that never changed. It's something that never altered my entire life. I always just wanted to study the ocean and study sharks. So it was not surprising that, you know, in order for me to figure out how to do that, the first step was to get myself underwater. So I worked very hard to expose myself to dive training, went through kind of initial dive training when I was 10 and 11. And I was literally writing the test to be a junior open water diver on my 12th birthday, which was the youngest age that you could get certified at the time. A few years later, I started up with underwater photography, and then I kind of moved straight into my dream of going out and sort of photographing sharks and kind of being with them in their environment. And it was just such an exciting time for me. I really felt like I was starting to achieve my dream. But then I kind of hit a wall because even though I was a diver, you know, I was a girl and I was in this male-dominated environment, and everywhere I went, you know, most of the divers were males, and every time I knocked on doors to try and introduce myself to scientists, especially shark biologists, they were men. And I mean, I was a kid and they did treat me like a kid, but I was also a girl. And I think a lot of people didn't take me seriously because of that. And even in school, I remember a lot of teachers trying to steer me away from sciences, from STEM fields, because they felt like there wasn't a strong future for girls in those fields. And I was very bright. I was the top of my class, but they kind of always gently nudged me over to like literature and other things like that. And so I was feeling a little bit confused and lost, and I didn't have very many role models at the time. And then in walked this woman who I was so fortunate to actually live almost down the street from. She lived very close to where I lived in Northern California. And my mom happened to read about her a few times in the news and saw that she was speaking in the Bay Area where I lived in California. And so I went to go see her, I think, for the first time speak when I was maybe 14 years old. And she changed everything for me. You know, for the first time, I actually saw someone who had achieved, actually, not just achieving, she already had achieved so many of the things that I had wanted to achieve myself, but wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do it. And she was a woman, and she had just broken down all these barriers, being like the first chief scientist for NOAA, you know, going not just where no man had gone before, but, you know, in many ways where no human had gone before in the deep sea. And she was just pioneering all of these amazing things like technology in terms of the submersibles that she was helping to design and use. So she was just such an exciting and inspiring person for me. You know, I just was like, finally, there was someone that I could look to and say, well, this is the kind of career that I want to have. And clearly you can achieve it, even if you're a girl. So that was like a really important breakthrough moment for me where I said, I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to become a scientist. And in those critical years between maybe 14 and in my early 20s, when I was still doing an undergrad at university, I really decided to focus. I thought the easiest way for me to get to where I needed to go was to build these skill sets that I knew were going to be valuable for me later. And so I got more serious with my underwater photography. I got mentored by a really great underwater photographer and later cinematographer, Tom Campbell, where I was living in Santa Barbara. Tom was pioneering things like high definition filmmaking underwater. It's one of the first to be doing that. And so I took notes. I followed his team around the world. He was also a technical diver. And so the people on his team were all doing technical diving. So I got nitrox certified, learned how to use mixed gas. I started to get experience using rebreather technology. And I really felt like those were critical years for me because I felt like by the time I got to the stage where I was doing field work of my own later in my 20s and 30s, I was so comfortable underwater, and I didn't have to get certified to do all these crazy types of tech diving then, because I knew how to use this gear already. I had my own gear already. So that was a really important time of my life. I also traveled extensively with him and his team, and just on my own. I would just travel around the world. And I felt like that was really important because the people that I would hear speak, from Sylvia Earle to Eugenie Clark or Jane Goodall, these people all seem to have this incredible context about just conservation and the world. And that comes from traveling and being well traveled. So I spent a lot of years traveling as well, which I think wasn't easy. It's expensive to travel. It's hard to travel when you're young. It's kind of even scary to travel when you're young. But I really put a strong focus on that. I studied and I saved all my money and I traveled. And I knew what I wanted to be because through some of my work with these cinematography teams that were making different documentaries, I had been able to go to South Africa when I was very young, about 17 or 18. I had started doing diving with white sharks there. I just became absolutely fascinated and amazed by these animals. And I thought to myself, surely I was going to go and become a white shark researcher. So as soon as I was able, I moved to Africa. But what I found at the time is that by the time I got there and was ready to go, there were other people in that space. There were other people working on white sharks. There was quite a lot of really capable researchers and science happening there on them. And so it really made me reflect on what I wanted to contribute as a conservationist and as a biologist. I didn't want to just go in and replicate what other people were doing. I didn't feel like it was needed. But at the same time as well, I was also volunteering for the IUCN, for the shark specialist group that was just forming. And this group was a volunteer group. And my involvement in this group really helped to shape who I am today as a conservation biologist. Because at the time, I was really unsure of whether or not I should go into white shark research. Literally at the same time, I was helping to start this group whose goal was to assess all of the shark and ray species across the globe so that we would have a better idea of the status globally for sharks and rays. And as we started to evaluate them, we could see that they were really kind of standing out as one of the most threatened groups of animals in the world in terms of their conservation status. And they kept sliding reviews across the table to me, and I would just see that there were so many species that of sharks and rays, for instance, which I'm really interested in, that have not been properly studied, that were not being evaluated properly, and there was just such a lack of data available that I thought to myself, white sharks seem to be good. I think I need to find another species that I can really help in the same way that these other, great biologists are helping white sharks. And then a very important assessment came across the table to me, which was manta rays. And I was so excited at the time because who doesn't love manta rays? I've been a diver my whole life. Everybody loves manta rays. They're just one of the most iconic animals in the ocean. But I was absolutely horrified when I started to look into the fact that there had been really no formal research on them. We didn't know much about them. I tried very hard to put together all the information I could on these animals, but ultimately at the end of the assessment period, I had to list them as data deficient. And that really sat with me. Why do we not know anything about some of the most beloved animals, some of the biggest, some of the most iconic animals in our ocean? I left South Africa and started traveling around the rest of Africa, exploring, trying to figure out where my place could be. And I took the opportunity to run some exploratory trips with groups that were starting to move into Mozambique right after the Civil War. Everybody knew this coastline to be beautiful, very long coast, and incredibly biodiverse, but it had been shut down for years and years and years because of a raging civil war there. So being able to go back into the country for the first time and start to explore it and dive it with the new technology that was available now was a really incredible opportunity for me. So I took that chance, went into the country, traveled all around, but really was impressed with this Inhambane province, which sits at the kind of like a quarter up the country. It was just so beautiful. And I mean, so pristine. I hadn't seen anything like it in my entire life. And I stumbled upon a manta ray population there, very large one. And so all of a sudden, the penny dropped and I realized maybe this was my moment. And I felt a little bit like Jane Goodall moving out to the middle of nowhere, building a tiny little leaf hut and just getting on with a study on these mantas for the first time. And it was probably one of the most extraordinary periods of my life. It just felt so authentic to be in this really wild place and studying these incredible animals for the first time. I'll always cherish the memories from that time. And I ultimately, as Joe mentioned, did a PhD on the mantas off that coastline. And because I was able to spend so much time in the water with them and get to know them, I was able to really focus on trying to collect those bits of data that were needed for the red list, so that the next time we evaluated this animal, that hopefully I would be able to list it actually, and rather than have it sit as data deficient. During my time there, I was lucky enough to describe the first species of manta that Joe was talking about. And that's because along the coast of Mozambique, the two different species of manta are sympatric, meaning that they live together. So I would go out to the reef and see images like this, where you would see a lot of smaller reef mantas swimming around and giant mantas would be coming through. And it was so clear to me that they were two different species. And of course, I didn't get a lot of support as a really young girl in my 20s from all my male professors saying, like, you've got to be kidding me. Obviously, there are not two different species of mantas. But I persisted and I was able to collect enough data to be able to demonstrate that they were after several years. And I think people were shocked because, mantas live all over the world, and they were surprised that no one had actually noticed this or picked up on this previously. And off the back of that work, I was very privileged to be able to do a major BBC documentary, and in describing the new species, needed to travel around the world anyway, to be able to look at these animals' distributions around the world. And that led to me traveling extensively around the world, looking at different manta populations. And unfortunately, it opened my eyes to the reality of what was facing mantas in terms of their in terms of conservation. There was a global trade starting up in their body parts, where their gill plates were being removed and taken to Asia, mainly China, to be used in medicinal tonics that don't actually work, but still there's a market for. And I just started to see this alarming global trend, and it was so shocking. So for me, I instantly realized that I needed to step out of my comfort zone in Mozambique. I started programs in Indonesia, Ecuador, Myanmar, Florida. I mean, we started programs all over the world on mantas and raced to try and figure out what was happening in these populations. But ultimately, I realized that that something else was needed, that we really needed to go after international level protection for these animals as fast as possible, because just working on them on the ground in several countries was not going to do it. So I became obsessed with the idea of getting these animals listed on the two major international conservation conventions, CMS, the Convention for Migratory Species Act, and CITES, the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species. And these two treaties, for me, were a way to be able to put mantas on the map, to be able to show people how much threats they were facing and how we really needed to take care if we didn't want to see populations being extirpated left, right, and center. And so we worked very hard for many years to get countries to champion these proposals and to get the information needed in the proposals. And ultimately, we were able successfully, with a group of other international researchers and conservationists, to get manta rays listed on the appendices of both of these international treaties. And it was an incredibly important moment, historic moment, but at the same time, at the end, I wasn't really sure where to go. That was my goal at the time. And this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about in this talk, is just the fact that you can have a plan for yourself, but ultimately, as you go on in a career, I think the most important thing is to listen to what's happening around you, to kind of really see and contextualize what's happening around you, and be able to always think ahead for, what's next. How can you build on the work that you're doing? Not necessarily scale up, as we've heard. Sometimes it's better to really focus. And so for me, I had to think, conservation for me is a bit like triage. I think it's really important to recognize some of the areas that may be too far gone, and also recognize what places you probably still can save, but you need to focus. And for me, Mozambique was one of those places where I felt like things were spinning out of control. I mean, animals, endangered species were being harvested all over the place. We could see massive population declines, just even for our mantas and whale sharks that we were focusing on at the time, just huge declines in their numbers. And it seemed like maybe it was too far gone, but I didn't believe it. And I loved the place so much that I told my team, we need to refocus from just all of the work we're doing globally, and we need to really focus on Mozambique if we're going to save this place. And I think it's worth saving. It's one of the most important areas for marine megafauna in Africa. And I thought to myself, well, just research alone on a couple of species isn't going to work. And so we started to toy with this idea of protecting ecosystems and protecting this seascape in Mozambique. And if, as a small NGO, we were going to be able to influence the protection of this area at all. And I decided that whatever it took, I wanted to be able to impact this area, because it was my home and I had spent most of my career there, but it was also an area that I felt so passionate about. It's so beautiful, it's so biodiverse, it's so important for marine megafauna, particularly sharks and rays. So I began to study and help with other conservation efforts there. Taking an ecosystem approach to it, working on a lot of the other species, many of them sharks, because we really do. We are, shark and ray biologists. And so we started to look at a lot of the other species that live there, really started to focus on some of the other very critically endangered species like the wedgefish, things like leopard sharks, and even start researching incredibly rare species like the small-eyed stingray that have never, been worked on before either. And this approach helped us understand what was happening across the seascape, what the threats were to all of these animals, what the problem areas were, what the areas were that we felt like we could affect change. And we also expanded a lot of our programs to be so much more than research. We started looking at sustainable livelihoods and how we can change the way that people fish, and whether there were better ways for them to do that or alternate livelihoods for them to have, integrating community conservation and looking at tourism and how that was going to start impacting the ecosystem there. And most importantly, we really went big and started to invest in education and awareness and capacity building. We started swimming programs, we started training biologists, we started training marine rangers in the country, and we just got really invested in the conservation of this coastline. And this woman then appeared in my life again as she made her famous TED Talk about the hope spots, and she created Mission Blue. She gave me hope and that inspiration that we could create these hope spots around the globe, that that people like herself could help champion causes like ours in even these really remote environments, and that together, as like a coalition of different conservationists across the globe, that we might be able to affect change by looking at what areas are the most important areas to protect, and then trying to make sure that change happens in those areas, and conservation is put on the radar in those areas. And so I had a lot of conversations with government in Mozambique, who, and ANAC, who's the Department of Conservation there. And we looked at the existing conservation areas and how we as MMF could partner with these areas over time to help expand on some of these areas and to manage them better. So we are working very hard with the 2 existing protected areas. And we're creating a new protected area with partners to the south of the existing protected areas that's going to increase the footprint by about 50%. And that's really exciting because it means that we're creating a seascape along this coastline. But the animals that we work with are highly migratory, and they only pass through any of these areas. They live along this entire coastline and even far out to sea. We know this. We know these are highly migratory animals, and you can't fence a park in the ocean. So you have to think big. And so I'm really excited about the next 10 years and the next maybe even 20, 30 years in Mozambique. I have a huge vision now, and Mission Blue and I just created a hope spot just a couple of weeks ago. That's a grand scale. It's a huge hope spot idea, but we're really excited about growing the current protected areas to something the size that these animals need. It's really ambitious, especially for Africa, but I intend to spend the rest of my life kind of focusing on this area and figuring out how to get the animals that I'm interested in protecting the area that they need in order to be safeguarded. So thanks very much. I'm privileged to be able to share my story with you today. I hope that helped, give you an idea of what we do here at MMF. And yeah, if there's any time, I'll take 1 or 2 questions.
There's always time for questions, Andrea. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Thank you for taking us back in time and walking us through your story, from inspirations to maybe people asking you why instead of why not. That's something we've really focused on this weekend. That's one of the first things Sylvia said when she kicked off the festival on Friday night, is we should be asking why not why. And your plans for the next 10, 20, 30 years are absolutely incredible. They're ambitious, they're bold. And why not? Why not have those big, bold, ambitious goals? Because that's how things get done. Yeah, very cool. So I think the first question I want to ask you is, we're going to share this playlist of events with our community of educators across North America and beyond. So out to 10,000 or so educators. And as educators, it's our job to inspire that next generation, to get them excited, and to get them asking those questions like why not. So you ran into maybe a few educators who tried to steer you in directions away from your passion. What advice would you give to educators when they see that spark of passion in their classroom?
I think it would be to take kids seriously. I think kids have a really great sense of who they are from a really young age. I mean, I think now as a parent, I can really appreciate that kids come into knowing who they are from a really, really young age. And I think that while it's important also to be able to put forward like realistic expectations for people, because I think that's, always important. I think that, when you can see a true passion in a kid, I think that you should really push that as much as you can. I feel very fortunate in my career to be doing exactly what I want to be doing. And I want that for everyone. I think that you perform best in your life if you're doing exactly what you feel like you're supposed to be doing. So I think every educator should try and figure out how to get kids to dig deep within themselves and find out where their real passion is, not what society thinks that they should be, but what really moves them. Because once you're motivated by that passion, I mean, the sky's the limit.
Oh, no question. I mean, our whole philosophy is that, well, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with hundreds and hundreds of scientists and explorers and adventurers and conservationists and hear their stories, and they share something really common. Everybody remembers when it happened. It might have been meeting someone, a book, a documentary, an inspiring educator, something. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, just triggered that passion and led them kind of on a career path, a career trajectory. So yeah, big and small, these inspirational things can happen. And that's why I love kind of where you ended off talking a little bit about marine megafauna and some of the education programs you're doing in the community. getting kids out and learning to swim, which might be a surprise to people. You know, you live on the coastline and you might think, well, of course they know how to swim. Can you talk a little bit about that program and why it might be that, you know, kids haven't learned to swim yet?
Well, you know, for me, it was that context again. As I spoke before, you know, I think the greatest thing I ever gave myself was context. You know, being able to have traveled around the world and to visit different areas and see how things are different in different places. And I could never figure out when I got to Africa at first why there was such a disconnect between, you know, people and the ocean. And then it dawned on me that the ocean in Africa is quite hostile. You know, big waves, huge crashing surf. It's not like the idyllic places in the South Pacific or in Indonesia or Thailand where kids grow up learning how to swim, jumping off piers. And there's a lot of loss of life. A lot of kids drown, a lot of fishermen drown. People are terrified of the ocean. There's big, scary animals out there in their mind. They haven't been educated properly about these animals. And so there's this huge disconnect. So for us, conservation started with trying to change that, you know, empowering kids by making them feel safe in the ocean for the first time, making their parents feel safe about taking them to the ocean because now they knew how to swim, and connecting them with these leviathans that live offshore. I mean, all they see is giant whales breaching and huge sharks and mantas flying out of the water and dolphins. I mean, it can be scary for a kid until you make them excited and passionate about these animals and show them that most of these animals can't even hurt them. So, you know, it was really about connecting them with the ocean. And as those kids have grown now over the last 20 years, they are now becoming dive instructors. They are now becoming, you know, the chiefs of fishing councils. They are now going into government. And that love for the ocean is going to, you know, touch all of the different, you know, aspects of their life and work. And hopefully will change the way that they behave and the way that they think about things. And so I think it's really, really important to invest in youth education. You just have to do it in a sustained way over time.
Absolutely. And I love that point. Representation is so important. So for this generation to see people like them in the ocean, studying, in government, researching, that's so important. And that really blazes a trail for them, something that they can follow when they see people in their community in those positions.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, Andrea, I want to share a few banners here because first of all, we want to drive people to check out marinemegafauna.org. And you know, you and I had a chat not too long ago about education and bringing it to not just Mozambique, but other places around the world, like Canada, the US. That education is so important. So there's the link if you want to check out some of Andrea's work. And then, of course, supporting that work is really important as well. And then if you want to follow along on some of her adventures, you can find her on Twitter and Instagram at Queen of Mantas. So, Andrea, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you. Safe travels tomorrow as you head back to Africa. But what a treat to have you for a little bit of time with such a clear connection. Of course, it's always great to connect from the field, and we love doing that. But it's nice to be able to connect this way from time to time as well.
Thanks. It was great to be here. And congratulations on such a wonderful event. I've been tuning in all weekend.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.